What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
Christmas at my parents' house has always carried that strange blend of tension and tradition, where the clinking of silverware and the hum of carols barely mask the undercurrent of judgment that runs beneath the surface. And that year was no exception as we gathered around the long oak table, decorated with garlands and candles, pretending that warmth and laughter were still part of this family's DNA. I had convinced myself that I could handle it, that sitting across from my younger sister Emily, who had perfected the art of slipping insults into sweet tones, would be nothing more than a test of patience, yet within minutes she proved me wrong. It happened between the mashed potatoes and the ham, just when everyone was leaning back, their glasses filled, their faces glowing red from wine and firelight. Emily leaned toward my parents with that faux innocence she always put on for an audience and said, "Honestly, I don't know why we keep dragging her here every year. She's such a burden to have around at Christmas." The room froze. My mother coughed into her napkin. My father attempted a half-smile. Some of the cousins glanced at each other, and then down at their plates, as if staring hard enough at peas would make the moment vanish. But it didn't vanish, it sat there, heavy and humiliating, pressing down on me harder than the stares that avoided my eyes. I didn't reply. That's the part that seemed to unsettle them most. No sarcastic retort, no angry outburst, just silence. I folded my napkin carefully, placed it by my plate, and let my face stay still. Inside, though, something snapped. It wasn't the first time Emily had jabbed at me, but it was the first time she'd done it so publicly, with my parents looking on like spectators unwilling to referee. And in that silence, as the room returned to its uneasy chatter, I realized that humiliation can sometimes spark clarity sharper than rage. I watched Emily sip her wine, her lips painted cherry red, her laugh cutting across the table as though nothing had happened. My mother touched her arm lightly, rewarding her with the same little gesture she had always reserved for the golden child, and my father launched into a story about a neighbor's holiday lights, desperately trying to plaster over the damage. They thought the evening could be rescued, that I would swallow it down like every other time, but I had already made a decision that no one else in the room knew was even possible. For years, I had been the quiet scaffolding behind Emily's life. Out of guilt, out of family loyalty, out of some misguided sense of obligation, I had used the benefits from my job to keep her on my health coverage. When she needed help with tuition, I had stepped in. When bills piled up, I had wired money, always under the unspoken agreement that she would never acknowledge it and that my parents would treat it as if it were some invisible hand from above. They had built her pedestal on my sacrifices, and she had the audacity to call me a burden in front of the entire family. That night, I smiled at my sister as she passed me the bread basket, the kind of smile that probably unsettled her if she had been paying close attention, but she was too busy basking in her own reflection in every approving glance from my parents. I kept my composure through dessert, laughed politely at the stories, helped clear the plates. On the surface, I was the same woman who had arrived with a bottle of wine and a plate of cookies, but underneath, I was already stripping away the foundation of Emily's comfort. By the time they were clinking glasses of eggnog in the living room, I had slipped away to the guest room with my laptop. The glow of the screen lit up the walls, decorated with framed photographs of family vacations that always seemed to feature Emily at the center. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment, not out of hesitation, but out of the strange thrill of knowing that I held the kind of power no one else in that house even suspected. The company portal opened smoothly, my credentials sliding me into the benefits system where her name sat neatly under mine. Emily Marie Collins, date of birth, covered spouse, and dependent benefits, all spelled out in neat rows that suddenly looked like threads I could cut with a single motion. I stared at the screen, hearing faint laughter from the other room, imagining my parents nodding along to Emily's jokes, and I felt that heavy blend of anger and satisfaction coil in my chest. With one click, the safety net she had never appreciated could vanish. I didn't press it yet. Not that night. I closed the laptop softly, placed it back on the desk, and rejoined the family with the same calm mask I had worn all evening. They had no idea that the balance of power had already shifted, that their careless words at the table had ignited a plan far colder than anything I had ever considered before. When I hugged my parents goodbye, my mother squeezed me absent-mindedly while her other hand clung to Emily's arm. My father muttered something about driving safe. Emily smirked, a tiny victorious curl at the edge of her mouth, thinking she had silenced me once again. But as I stepped into the cold night air, the frost biting at my face, I whispered to myself a promise she would never see coming. Because the burden, as she had so carelessly named me, was about to disappear, but not in the way she imagined. That night, while they were still clinking glasses and unwrapping each other's praise, I lay awake in my bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, already replaying the sound of that click I would make. The first cut was ready. Morning arrived with that crisp winter glare that makes every surface look cleaner than it is, and while I brewed coffee in my tiny kitchen, counting the slow drips like they were seconds to a verdict, I rehearsed the lines I would never say out loud to anyone in my family, the lines about duty dressed up as love and love performing as control, because I had learned the hard way that when you fund someone's stability, they don't thank you. They simply forget who built the floor under their feet. I took the mug to my desk, opened the laptop, and logged in without hesitation, because hesitation is what I had done for years. Telling myself that this month was too stressful, or that Emily had a lot on her plate, or that my parents would be embarrassed if they knew, and while those excuses stacked up like dirty dishes, my resentment fermented into something strong enough to drink straight. So I did. The benefits portal was exactly where I had left it on Christmas night, sterile and cheerful in that corporate way, pastel checkmarks promising wellness and security, and beneath my name, right where it had always sat, was hers, a dependent attached by policy rather than gratitude. Protected by a plan she only acknowledged when she needed a prescription refilled or a doctor's visit covered, which is to say she acknowledged it often and never with a thank you. I clicked into the coverage settings, read the warnings that were designed to spook careless employees, and felt a strange calm settle in my chest, the kind of calm you feel right before you cut a rope that has been chafing your hands for too long. And when the confirmation window appeared asking whether I truly intended to remove one Emily Marie Collins from dependent coverage, I imagined the Christmas table again, her cherry lipstick and my mother's gentle approval, and I pressed confirm with a decisiveness I had reserved up to now for other people's emergencies. The system spun for a moment, a polite will turning like a breath held in a crowded elevator, and then it was done, a neat line item switching from active to terminated as if nothing monumental had occurred, as if I had not just shifted the gravity of my family by a few crucial degrees. Immediately afterward, I expected guilt to come sprinting through the door like a firefighter, yet what arrived instead was a clear-headed inventory of facts, the ledger of the last several years opening page by page in my mind. The late-night calls about urgent care copays that I covered without flinching, the monthly premium quietly increased when the company changed carriers, the holiday bonuses that went to dental work, the baseline knowledge that if Emily got sick I would be the one fielding the bills, arguing with the pharmacy, and soothing my mother's worry with my credit card. If this sounds cold, then perhaps you have never spent your energy on someone who uses your generosity to polish her entitlement, because once you have, you realize the coldness isn't cruelty, it is refrigeration. A way to preserve what little of yourself you have left before it spoils. The email that followed my action was an automated courtesy notice I had configured years ago, a bland message sent to the dependent to confirm coverage changes, which in hindsight was a small mercy since I had no intention of calling. No interest in hearing my sister perform shock like a Broadway understudy, and no patience for my mother's soft interrogations that always ended with a suggestion that I not make waves during the holidays. I watched the outgoing mail status turn to sent, pictured the notification banner sliding across Emily's screen while she applied mascara or stirred oat milk into her coffee, and wondered whether she would forward it to our mother with a caption that matched her tone at dinner, or whether she would call me first in that sugary voice she used when asking for favors, pretending that we were close, pretending that history could be spackled over with the right inflection. By midday, I had heard nothing, which somehow felt worse than immediate outrage, because silence gives imagination room to redecorate the truth. And I know my sister well enough to guess that she was not sitting quietly in gratitude for a generosity finally withdrawn. She was strategizing, which in our family typically involves choosing which parent to weaponize first. I used the waiting hours to comb through my finances with a ruthlessness I had never afforded myself, canceling one recurring transfer that disguised itself as tutoring fees, flagging a monthly charge for a student account that was supposed to be temporary, and bookmarking the bursar portal for the university that had greeted my money more warmly than it ever greeted me, because if I had learned anything from Christmas dinner, it was that my presents could be edited out of the story, but my payments were always front and center, like a sponsor's logo on a team that didn't want me in the photo. Around late afternoon, as the sunlight slid into that pale gold that makes even unpaid bills look sentimental, my phone lit up with my mother's name, and after a long ring it fell silent and then returned immediately, and I let it go to voicemail twice. Not because I was playing a game, but because I wanted a record of her first impulse, the unvarnished version she would later insist I had misheard. The message came in fragments at first, a rush of breath and then words arranged like a soft accusation, asking whether I knew that Emily's coverage had been affected by some company glitch, hinting that I should check on things since I was good with computers, layering concern with the suggestion that my competence be used in service of the same old arrangement, and while I played it back, another message arrived from Emily herself, feigning confusion, asking if something weird happened, offering a brittle laugh followed by a suspicious pause where I could hear the gears turning as she crafted the line that would keep her blameless. I didn't call back, not yet, because a cut only works if you resist the urge to immediately stitch it, and instead I opened the university portal I had bookmarked, entered the credentials I had set up long ago when I was told that handling the payments would be easier this way, and I stared at the upcoming tuition schedule that looked like a calendar of obligations masquerading as opportunities, seeing clearly for the first time that my complicity had been cast as kindness when in truth it had been the price of admission to a family that always seated me at the edge of the table. With the cursor blinking beside the auto-pay toggle, I inhaled once, thought of the word burden snapping through the air like a twig underfoot, and prepared to let the second domino fall. The auto-pay toggle sat there like a smug little doorman holding open the entrance to my generosity, and while the cursor blinked in a tight, impatient rhythm, I thought about the way that function had been sold to me as convenience, as if convenience were not just a softer word for surrender, and then I clicked, not in a flourish, not with a drumroll, but with the simple, unceremonious motion of someone turning off a lamp in a room that no longer deserved light, after which the portal dutifully refreshed and replaced the soothing green label with a calm gray that said manual billing, and the ledger that once marched forward with its tidy deductions now stood still, as if waiting for an apology that was never going to arrive. I did not write an apology, and I did not send a warning, because both of those things had been my currency for too long, so instead I folded the laptop halfway shut, watched the thin line of the screen glow like the horizon before a storm, and listened for the first rumble, which predictably appeared as a chime from my phone announcing a text from Emily that pretended at confusion before it lunged for accusation, asking whether the portal was down or whether I had accidentally changed something, using that fat little word accidentally the way she always did when she wanted to insult me while leaving herself an exit. I did not respond, not right away, and in the quiet that followed I remembered the enrollment call from 2 years earlier where a cheerful bursar representative had thanked me for supporting a student's success, a phrase that landed in my chest like a harmless feather and later hardened into a stone, because the truth was that the school had become another family member, one that smiled at my card every month and never once asked whether the arrangement was fair. And I suspect that if the university had seats at our Christmas table, they would have clinked their glasses when Emily said I was a burden. An hour later, the polite version of the storm passed, and the fast one followed, a series of calls from unknown numbers that resolved into the billing office, their tone professional but edged, asking whether the sponsor had changed her plans for the upcoming term and explaining in patient syllables that absent payment the registration would be placed on hold, a phrase that sounded bureaucratic but which I knew would attach itself to Emily's future like a small, aggressive barnacle. I thanked the representative for the clarity and said that I had indeed changed plans, and when she asked whether there would be another payment method added, I said that the student could handle that directly, at which point the woman paused, perhaps surprised by how quickly I had pulled the plug, and offered a soft understood that almost made me feel for her, because she was the only person in the chain who had spoken to me with uncomplicated respect. Within minutes my phone lit up again, this time with my mother's name, and although I let the first call slide into voicemail, the second and third followed with the stubbornness of habit, so I answered the fourth and stood at my kitchen counter, fingers flat on the cool surface, while she inhaled sharply and began with that practiced blend of concern and reprimand, saying she had heard there was some confusion with coverage and tuition, and that perhaps we could smooth things over since the holidays were not the time for drama, eh? Sentence so dense with irony I could almost taste sugar. I told her there was no confusion, and that I had simply decided to stop paying for things that were consistently used to keep me in my place, and she made a wounded sound and said I was overreacting to one comment at dinner, as if that single moment had not carried the weight of years, and then she did the thing she always does when she feels her grip loosening, which is to invoke family reputation and illness in the same breath, mentioning that Emily had a specialist appointment in a few weeks and that without coverage it would be complicated, hoping I would hear the word complicated and rush to spare them the work of complication, but I let the word sit there between us like a foghorn that only I could ignore. She shifted tactics with a brittle laugh, suggesting that surely I had not meant to cancel anything, that it must have been a glitch, and when I said it was intentional, she lowered her voice to the register she used for funerals and said, very quietly, that I would regret this. I could have argued, I could have poured out every ledger entry and late-night call, but instead I asked her a question I had never dared to ask, which was whether she had heard Emily at the table and whether she agreed. And the silence that followed carried the shape of truth more clearly than any admission, because my mother is a master at talking, yet in that moment she could not find a sentence that did not betray her own preferences. She muttered that holidays are stressful and that people say things they do not mean, and when I asked why Emily's stress always required my money while my pain required my silence, she exhaled a long, slow breath and said we should all be careful about doing something we cannot undo, which sounded like a warning until I realized it was also a superstition, as if the moment I allowed myself power I might summon some curse. We ended the call polite in tone and jagged in content, and almost immediately a message arrived from Emily that had shed the costume of confusion and replaced it with rage dressed as reason, insisting that my payments were part of a family agreement, that deadlines were imminent, that I was embarrassing our parents by making them deal with this, and that she would be forced to escalate, a term that made me laugh in spite of myself because escalation had been the quiet pulse of my entire adulthood, and I was finally the one directing the pace. I put the phone down, opened the laptop again, and printed the confirmation notices, not because I wanted trophies, but because I have learned that proof matters when the story is eventually rewritten without you. After which I slid the pages into a folder the color of storm clouds and sat back with a steadiness I had not felt in years, understanding that the second cut had been not just decisive but precise, a recalibration rather than a tantrum, and that while my sister and my mother assembled their scripts for the next act, I would take the one step they never believed I had the nerve to take, the step that does not sever money but sever access. Which is to say I scrolled to the very bottom of my contacts, hovered over 2 familiar names, and prepared my thumb for the quietest weapon I own. The contact list on my phone had always felt like a family tree written in glass, tidy and deceptively permanent. Yet as I scrolled past cousins and aunts and the old family neighbor who still brought over rhubarb pie in the spring, I realized how many branches existed only because I had been the one watering them, so I pressed and held on my mother's name until the menu bloomed like a tiny, obedient flower, and I chose the option that promised silence. The kind of silence that could not be guilt or scolded or sermonized into surrender, after which I did the same to my father and then to Emily, and while each block slid into place, I felt not triumph exactly but alignment, as if the furniture of my life had been shuffled for years and was finally being set down where it should have been from the start, which is to say out of the walkway where it could stop bruising my shins every time I tried to pass. The immediate quiet that followed was not empty, because nothing about this house or this season or this particular family was ever empty. Rather, it was a charged pause like the air before thunder, and during that humming interval I opened my laptop, signed into every account I had once shared in a misguided attempt at closeness, and began the process of changing what I could change and removing what I could remove, not because I cared about the trivia of streaming passwords or shared shopping carts, but because I wanted to dismantle the small conveniences that had been mistaken for intimacy, the little handholds Emily used when she wanted my effort without my presence. I started with the store card that had carried her textbooks and her winter coat and the boots she swore were necessary for internships, an account I had allowed her to access as an authorized user on the promise that she would only use it for school expenses, which of course had become a flexible category that stretched to include dinner with friends, because networking mattered, and a weekend trip, because mental health mattered. And while I do not dispute that either of those things matter, I do dispute the idea that my quiet willingness should be treated as an endless well, so I revoked the authorization with a single checkbox and watched the system replace her name with a small dash that looked, to me, like a door gently closing. From there I moved to the bank transfer templates that had been saved for years under polite labels, tuition support and health incidentals and emergency fund, and I deleted them with the deliberate care of someone dismantling a device that had been humming too loudly for too long, knowing exactly which wire to pull so that the lights would finally go out in the rooms that never welcomed me. All the while my phone lit up with the frantic choreography I had expected, calls piling on calls and texts arriving with that breathless punctuation that pretends urgency where entitlement actually lives. And because I have learned that drama feeds on an audience, I refuse to be cast as one, instead opening my email and building the kind of barrier that does not advertise itself. A lattice of filters and rules that redirected messages containing certain names and certain phrases into a quiet archive, where they could sob themselves hoarse without ever knocking on my attention, and as I nested those conditions together, I felt the strangest surge of relief. A sensation that made me laugh at my desk, because in the end the thing I had always wanted from my family was permission to not be constantly on call, to not be the default solution, to not be a convenient character in the story of their lives. The laugh surprised me, and because it surprised me it also steadied me, and with that steadiness, I drafted one final message from the account I used for administrative errands, a clean, impersonal note addressed to the benefits department at work, confirming in precise language the coverage change I had executed and requesting that any future inquiries from my family be directed to their own providers. Which might sound cruel until you remember that cruelty is sometimes just the word people use for boundaries that inconvenience them. When I had done everything I could do without leaving the house, I stood at the window and watched dusk slip down the street, the kind that turns holiday decorations into little islands of brightness floating in a darker sea. And I let myself remember the many winters I had spent trying to earn praise that would not arrive, and the birthdays that had been forgotten and then smoothed over, and the countless times I had been told not to make things harder, as if the act of asserting my needs were some rude weather I had brought into the room. Then, because I am not a saint and do not aspire to be one, I allowed myself one last, petty kindness, which was to log into the family photo drive and remove my name from the shared list, letting the slideshow roll on without me the way so many dinners had. The phone, which I had left face down, began to buzz not with calls, but with the old-fashioned persistence of voicemail notifications stacking atop one another, and although I had determined not to listen, I opened the transcription of one that my carrier attempted and saw, almost comically, a half-sentence from my mother that read as if she had sprinted to the edge of her patience and leapt, a fragment about a clinic and a form, and how could I do this to family, and I closed it not because I didn't care but because I cared enough to stop the cycle, after which I took a breath, returned to my desk, and performed the quietest, most definitive move of the day by setting a blanket due Not disturb for every number that had ever been used against me, a digital gatehouse that required no apology and offered no exceptions. From the hallway the heater kicked on with a low, steady growl, and the apartment filled with that warm, slightly metallic scent of winter air being tamed, and I told myself I could sleep now because the work was done. Yet as I shut the laptop, the screen caught the reflection of a small red badge blooming on my email icon, a count that rose from 1 to 3 to 5 while I watched, and I thought of how many times I had been taught to rush toward alarm. Then surprised myself by sitting back down and opening the inbox anyway, because boundaries are not the absence of attention, they are the decision to choose where attention goes, and in the first line of the newest message I saw my mother's name paired with a single, uncharacteristic verb that stopped me cold and made the room feel suddenly smaller, which is how I knew that whatever came next would not be another round of polite manipulation, but something messier and more dangerous, something that would require me to decide how far my resolve could stretch without snapping. The subject line of my mother's message was the kind of thing she usually reserved for funerals or family emergencies, stark and unadorned, simply the word please, which struck me harder than any insult Emily had ever lobbed across a table. Because my mother had never used the language of supplication with me before, she had always spoken from the pulpit of authority, the confident matriarch who expected me to absorb the blows of the family and still rise with a smile, yet here she was, typing into the void with a tone that carried more tremor than command. When I opened the message, the words unfolded in one unbroken rush, my mother insisting that things had gone too far, that Emily was distraught and unwell, that my father was shaken to see the sisters estranged in such a public, humiliating way, and that I, as the older one, as the supposedly steadier one, had an obligation to fix the damage before it became permanent. She wrote that Emily had been in tears for hours, that she was coughing and restless, that she feared the stress might trigger something serious, and then she dropped the sentence that made my chest tighten with a cocktail of fury and sorrow. If something happens to her, it will be on your conscience. I read it 3 times, each pass slower than the last, until the meaning pressed into me like cold metal against the skin, because beneath the dramatics and manipulations I could hear the faintest crack of real fear. And even if that fear was exaggerated or misplaced, it was enough to force me to imagine Emily pacing her apartment, mascara streaked down her cheeks, ranting into her phone at whichever friend still tolerated her spirals, believing with her whole chest that I had ruined her life. And I could not quite tell whether that vision satisfied me or disturbed me. The inbox bloomed with more messages as I sat frozen at the table, messages from cousins forwarding my mother's pleas, from an aunt I had not heard from in months who wrote that family is family no matter what words are spoken, from my father who added only a clipped "call your mother," as if brevity could disguise the desperation beneath it. The storm had clearly broken, and while part of me felt vindicated, another part felt the kind of hollow echo that comes when victory arrives without a crowd to cheer it. I closed the laptop once, telling myself that the silence would settle if I ignored it, but the air in the apartment grew thicker, as though the words themselves had seeped through the screen and lodged in the walls, so I reopened it and reread the original message. This time slower, noticing the deliberate structure of it, the way my mother moved from plea to accusation to guilt in smooth arcs, a practiced litigator who had built her case on the bones of my loyalty. She reminded me of the trips I had taken as a child when Emily was sick and I was told to fetch water and sit quietly. She reminded me of the holidays when Emily had been the star of every anecdote while I played supporting cast. She reminded me of the summers when money had been tight and I had been asked to be patient so that Emily could pursue whatever she needed. And though she did not write those memories explicitly, they were present in every line. Ghosts summoned to remind me of my role. I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box for a long while, my fingers hovering above the keys like hesitant soldiers waiting for a command, and I imagined what I could type if I wanted to detonate everything. A meticulous account of every dollar spent, every favor extended, every wound endured, laid bare in paragraphs so undeniable that even my mother could not spin them, but as the fantasy sharpened I realized it would not matter. because the story would still be rewritten in there. Voices, and I would still be painted as the difficult one who refused to forgive. So I deleted the draft, shut the box, and sat in the dim light of my kitchen until the clock told me it was almost midnight, the hour when silence becomes both friend and enemy. And I wondered if this was the cost of finally refusing to be the family's invisible backbone. Sleep came in broken fragments that night, full of dreams where Emily alternated between sobbing and smirking, and when I woke to the gray light of morning, the inbox had swollen with even more pleas, some angrier, some softer. All of them circling the same message: undo what you have done, or risk losing us forever. I drank my coffee slowly, let the bitterness coat my tongue, and thought about the word forever, how it had been used against me my whole life, a promise when it suited them, a threat when it did not. And I understood that forever was a word that bound me only if I allowed it. I considered replying with a single line, something curt and final, but instead I did nothing, and in that nothingness I felt both liberated and lonely, a combination so sharp it almost drew tears. By the time the day slid into afternoon, I had made my choice, though it was less a decision and more a surrender to what had already happened. I would not answer, not yet, perhaps not ever. Because sometimes the most powerful statement is silence that refuses to bend. I closed the laptop, powered down the phone, and sat by the window watching people on the street carry bags of groceries, argue over parking spots, kiss their children's foreheads, ordinary lives untouched by the kind of Cold War that had erupted in mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had stepped off the stage of a play I had never auditioned for. When night returned, I thought again of my mother's email, the way the word please had looked on the screen, stark and almost tender, and I let myself imagine what might happen if I gave in, if I called her back and said we could meet. If I reinstated the payments with the click of a button, if I allowed the cycle to resume, and the thought filled me not with comfort but with dread, because the truth I had uncovered was simple. Forgiveness in this family was just another word for resetting the trap. So I whispered a quiet goodbye to the version of myself who would have caved, turned off the light, and went to bed with the strange knowledge that for once, the burden had been handed back to those who named me one. Whether they would collapse under it or learn to carry it, I did not know, and that unknowing, sharp, unresolved, almost cruel, was the closest thing to peace I had ever felt.